anybody want to be liked? Is it good to be liked at media days? If it's not, Oklahoma's in perfect position and Texas is screwed. That's what I've learned so far in Dallas. Yeah, we are in red hot, scorching hot downtown Dallas, Texas. Tuesday, July 16th, the year of our Lord 2024. We're still jam-packed. It's not just an SEC show. Contrary to the background, we've actually got to span the whole country tonight. College football conference realignment, depending on your opinion on where it's about to go, was dealt a severe body blow by Brett McMurphy this morning. Does that fall in line with what we've been thinking on this show? I'll talk about that. We've got real contenders out there, and then we've got summer contenders out there, and then some are, some aren't. Which ones are which? We're going to talk about a couple of those tonight. I want your opinion on Steve Sarkisian. Just flat out, give it to me like an adult. What is your opinion on the Texas head coach? I got bold predictions. I've got what-ifs. We've got a jam-packed show. Being on the road stops none of that. In fact, some say we prefer to be on the road. They're watching us in Roanoke, Virginia, Prosperity, South Carolina, Monroe, Louisiana, Alabaster, Alabama. Thank you guys so much. At Late Kick Josh, we got all kinds of access out here. Most of my conversations today were off the record with coaches, a couple of players as well. I share that when I can, but we have gotten a lot of good stuff out here today, and in due time, we'll sort of weave it into the show. But in the meantime, okay, so conference realignment has been the biggest collective story in college football for like 5 years now. It was at this event, SEC Media Days, 3 years ago that Texas and OU, 3 years later, they're going to come to the SEC. So I've been waiting with bated breath, as have many of you. What's the next domino to fall? Now, I've been cryptic intentionally. I've been vague intentionally when I've spoken about this. Not because I'm sitting on some big story, quite the opposite. It's because I'm sitting on general information, and otherwise I'm looking through a cloud of fog just like everyone else is. So this morning, Brett McMurphy of Action Network puts out a really, really comprehensive story. Number of university presidents quoted, athletic directors quoted, TV network executive types quoted, and it didn't sound good for the prospects of, let's say, Florida State going to the Big Ten or Florida State going to the SEC. That falls right in line with the feeling that I've had for a month and a half or so. There was a point where I thought Florida State to the Big Ten or the SEC made a lot of sense. In fact, I still think it makes a lot of sense, but it makes a lot of sense from a fan's perspective. It doesn't make a lot of sense from the perspective of the people making these decisions, and whether that's right or wrong or indifferent, we'll talk about that. We can hash that out another time. But the Big 12 or independence has been where I thought Notre Dame and Clemson may be headed for a while. I had it told to me point blank by someone in a very authoritative position in the Big Ten, they're not coming here. Whatever that means to you is whatever that means to you. And that was weeks ago, okay? I certainly wasn't given permission to say that on the record. Well, now McMurphy's run with this, so I'm telling you. That's what was told to me. That's the sentiment that I've heard from anyone I would believe on this. It was FSU and it was Clemson. Now, here's the thing. Most people I've spoken to stop there. They don't include North Carolina in that. They don't include Virginia in that. I think there's good reason for that, because while those two, Florida State and Clemson, may not have current access or a current invitation to one of the big two, maybe if the ACC dissolved, maybe North Carolina would be more attractive. Maybe Virginia would be more attractive for reasons that don't necessarily interest you and I, but interest, the suits that are in these rooms making these decisions. There was very strong language in this Brett McMurphy piece today about how uncooperative a member institution Florida State has been, and I took note of that because they didn't mention anyone else. Florida State's been disruptive. Florida State, through no fault of their own. I'd be the same way if I were you guys, so I'm not faulting you at all, but the powers that be in these other conferences that have their hands on the lever, they made sure to say in this Brett McMurphy piece, ooh, do we really want Florida State? I mean, look at how much they've misbehaved over there. What would they be like in our conference? They'd give you really good football games. That's what they'd be like. I don't really know what else to make of that. You still don't know. Okay? That's the headline here. I saw some of you who were sharp enough to go back in time and find media pieces once upon a time that had people anonymously quoted as saying, the Big Ten's not interested in Oregon. The Big Ten's not interested in Washington. Both Washington and Oregon will play a Big Ten schedule this year because they're in the conference. So there were a few people anonymously quoted in this Brett McMurphy piece who did say never say never. That's not the takeaway, though. I'm telling you, I've been around hundreds of media types today, and the takeaway has been, wow, well, now that the SEC and the Big Ten are out the window, is FSU really going to go to the Big 12? Is Clemson really going to go to the Big 12? Hey, the door's not absolutely slammed shut on that. Okay? I don't believe it's about to happen. I don't believe that's imminent. The door's not shut on that. In other words, it's easy to say that now, that status quo is what it is. If the ACC were to crumble tomorrow, I don't know how that would happen, just humor me. If the ACC were to just implode in on itself, and Florida State's just sitting there, and Clemson's just sitting there, you telling me those conferences are really going to look as they drive by and say, oh man, I hope someone picks that guy up. We got to get to the next town, though. I doubt that. Maybe that's the case. I doubt that. Having said that, I now want to talk about the difference between how we think, you and I, largely, versus how they think, the people who are making these decisions. I don't want any of this to happen. Let me put it perfectly clear, because I don't think I've been clear enough on this. I'd like to hit the rewind button. Not only do I not want any more realignment, I'd like to undo the realignment we had. I don't think Oregon has any business playing in the Big Ten. Okay, I wish Texas and OU were still in the Big 12. In fact, I wish the Southwest Conference and the Big 8 were still around. So I'd love to go back to a time before I was born. We can't do that, though. So speaking in practical modern day terms, I think it's pretty wild how a lot of these folks make their decisions. There's two schools of thought. One school of thought is, all right, we've got the markets and the footprints and the media landscape, and we want to make sure we lock down this market and that market. Why would we want this school? We've already got those media markets. That's one way to think. And there used to be a lot of merit in thinking that way. Nowadays, and the train of thought that I buy into, is an inventory-based mentality. And that basically sounds like this. If you're the SEC or you're the Big Ten, you already matter coast to coast. Whether the Big Ten has someone in Florida or not, people in Florida are watching major Big Ten games. So you shouldn't make your moves. Once you've saturated the market nationally, your moves shouldn't be to go grab as many media markets as you can, as much as it should be go grab as much precious inventory as you can. So if I'm the SEC, for example, if I added Florida State and Clemson, no, I don't grab a huge market share in the states of Florida or South Carolina that I didn't already have. What I do is I put FSU versus Oklahoma on my schedule. I put Clemson versus Alabama on my conference schedule. I put those pieces of inventory on the shelf, just like I put Texas versus Georgia or Oklahoma versus Auburn on the shelf with this last round of realignment. That's what realignment should be about to me, and I guarantee you 98% of people watching or listening to this, that's all you care about. You don't care about media markets. You don't care about AAU accreditation. Half of you don't even know what that is, and that's fine, because it doesn't interest you. It's not why you watch a show like this. It's not why you turn the games on Saturday. Which brings me to my last point. Have you noticed one of the drums we like to beat whenever this conversation is brought up? Have you noticed how distant the concept of fans and players has been in this conversation? It always seems to be that when the biggest decisions are made in college athletics, sports that ideally center around players and are built to be as big as they are because of fans, when the biggest decisions get made, no one mentions the player, no one mentions the fan. Because really, at the end of the day, yeah, we've come along and we've watched for a long time. We've built these up to be major value propositions, and players have come through, and they've built universities up to be major value propositions. But ultimately what happens is someone who really wasn't responsible for doing either of those things gets placed in a chair, and they throw on a suit worth more than your wardrobe, and they make these calls. And I can either be upset about it, I can scratch my head at it, I can nod in approval at it. That's the way it's going to happen. I will say again, as I've said for the entirety of this ordeal, no one knows ultimately where this is going. And I've been saying that, and I've been accused of either not telling you the whole story, or being intentionally vague or clickbaiting, whatever that means in this entire context. No, I really mean there is no definitive answer. There's still not. Today, the most informed people, there are several of them here, guys, the most informed people, they'll give you their opinion. You know, the opinion I got a lot was, hey, Florida State, if they do pony up that money to get out of the ACC, they're not doing that just to go to the Big 12. Okay, if they don't have anywhere else to go, where do they go? Like, you know, that's an impasse. But everyone's got their opinion. No one knows. Every conversation wraps with, I don't know, man, we'll see. Yeah, we will. But at least we had Brett McMurphy deliver a lot of the stuff that everyone's been whispering about in an actual piece that everyone could read publicly. That's over at Action Network, by the way, if you want to go read that. In the meantime, yeah, we're at SEC Media Days. A little bit earlier start time than usual. Gigi's got a bedtime, okay? She's got to go get dinner. She's got a bedtime. And so we had to start the show early. It has nothing to do with me wanting to get out of here. I promise you that. That doesn't sound like me at all. I appreciate you guys being tuned in, though. Make sure you're subscribed to both the YouTube channel and the pod if you haven't already. Many, many, many of you have. A few of you are holding out, whether you know it or not, so make sure you check. So we've been at SEC Media Days. We'll be here all week. I wanted to tell you just a few things, you know, some of the buzz I've picked up on around here. We talked to a lot of coaches, a lot of administrative types. The Texas fatigue is insane. It's legitimately insane. We're in the state of Texas. Sark and Texas, as we're talking with each other here Tuesday night, they haven't even come yet. They haven't even shown up yet. And everyone's asking questions about Texas. Everyone wants to talk about Texas. Every radio hit I've done, in the big media room, every coach, all they've been asked about is Texas. So what I'm trying to tell you Texas haters is, I get it. I'm not among you, but I get it. Because if that's what it's really like, if that's what life has really been like in the Big 12 forever, if that's what life in this state for a non-Texas fan has been like, okay, I will grant you that. You got reason to feel the way you do. I gave the most boring answers possible today because I had the Texas sucks crowd, and I had to say, well, they clearly don't suck. They went to the playoff last year. Their over-under win total's 10.5 in the SEC. They clearly don't suck. And then I got this other crowd that says, you know, Sark, he's less than a god, but he's certainly much more than a man. And I'm like, let's pump the brakes on that front as well. Texas, I think, could accurately be described as a really good program, probably still trending up. Probably haven't hit their ceiling yet. It's a treacherous thing, though. There's a tightrope walk that has to be accomplished by them. There's a unique pressure that's on Texas. They moved from the Big 12 to the SEC, and that does carry a lot of weight with it. Make no mistake. It's still a tightrope walk. It's just the difference in walking a tightrope 10 feet off the ground versus 10 stories off the ground. Technically, nothing changes. Technically, the way you walk a tightrope 10 feet off the ground is the same way you walk a tightrope 10 stories off the ground. Difference being, everyone knows you can fall when you're 10 feet off the ground. It may hurt, you may sprain your ankle, but you can get up and climb right back up the ladder and try again. That was life in the Big 12. You fall from 100 feet, you fall from 10 stories up, you're street pizza, you're done. And it's not that they can't afford to lose, per se, but the level of play collectively, like I have got a question one of you gave me later in the show about Sark and Texas. How will they look when they just face quality competition more frequently? That's totally fair. Totally fair. They haven't even come through here yet, though. In Dallas, they're a Wednesday team, day 3 team, and the Texas fatigue has already set in. Tennessee, total wildcard team. Even their folks will tell you behind the scenes, as they did in the spring when we were in Knoxville and did the show there, it's like, we know what we've got physically in Nico Iamaleava, the quarterback. We know what we've got. Or at least we're pretty sure we know what we got. However, there's this $1 million question always with a first-year starter at quarterback. How does he process? You know, how does he just deal with that spotlight? Is he just a player on the team, or is it his team? And they really believe Nico Iamaleava is that kind of guy. And they weren't shy about saying that. In fact, you know, talking to Heupel before we sat down with him, and I talked to him again today, he's like, look, I mean, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I think I know a fair amount about this kind of thing. He's our guy, and we're comfortable riding with him. We're comfortable giving him the keys to the offense. It's a lot to say. About a first-year starter, it's a lot to say. You want to do a fun little exercise that lets you know how rare it is. If they're right about him, how rare that is, do this. Go find the former 5-star rated quarterbacks. Just look around the country. Find the guys who were rated 5 stars out of high school. Tell me how many of them have played a season of 5-star caliber football. The list is not long. And I'm not hating on our rankings council. In fact, I don't think they whiffed on these guys. I just think it's that hard. It's that hard to play that position at that level. So if they get that from him this year, Tennessee's not some cute story that could exist on the fringes of playoff contention. If you answer that question, then they're a prime contender. You don't have a whole lot of elite quarterback play. It's not a thing that happens a whole lot. And you can name me exceptions to the rule, and I'll say that's just what they are, exceptions to the rule. Kirby Smart, I think a lot of people assumed, was going to be the face of the SEC. Once Nick Saban retired, you just naturally say, all right, well, who's the next biggest name? Who's the next best? What's the next biggest program? Well, the answer is Kirby in Georgia. Okay, so then the follow-up is, well, Saban used to be the guy everyone turned to. When there was a question, there's this existential threat to the sport. The portal's changing. Let's go ask Nick what he thinks. Oh, man, look what NIL's doing. Let's ask Nick what he thinks. Well, now he's the one asking questions, which is a surreal scene, by the way. Watching Nick Saban ask Brian Kelly questions the other day, for example. Crazy. Be that as it may, that's his new job. And so you've got a ton of oxygen in the room. This stuff matters beyond the SEC. But even in the SEC, I don't think Kirby Smart is the kind of guy who's just dying to grab that mantle. When we had him on the show, you remember we went up to Athens or down to Athens. We sat face to face with him. I said, face of the SEC, face of college football. Used to be Nick Saban. He's stepped aside now. He's doing media. Like, is that you? And he said, I don't know if you just assume that. No one assumes that role. It's probably a multiple person shared responsibility, but you got to earn that. He earned it over decades, not a couple of years. So Kirby's not that right now. And you can feel they don't have that in the sport right now. Kirby's probably as close as we have to it. I know Kirby Smart is very influential, in like the rules committee and whatnot. He's very vocal there. He should be. He's very knowledgeable, one of the foremost authorities on the game at the head coaching level today, or in general, not just today. But the face of the SEC is really interesting. I don't know that it matters on a Saturday in general, but it's interesting. Shane Beamer was in here yesterday. I always love being around South Carolina this time of year because they are excellent at showcasing themselves. They're excellent at creating hype. Now, in the past, I've just had fun with that, and then I've been ridiculed on the show because you accuse me of buying into South Carolina hype, and then they lose games in the fall, and then you were wrong. That's what they tell me. You were wrong. Well, I haven't even made a prediction on South Carolina. I will do that soon. However, your point has been taken. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to acknowledge South Carolina, the momentum feels great. The energy feels great around the program. Then you pause. However, other places probably have some pretty good energy of their own right now. Other places probably have some pretty good momentum. No one feels bad about their trajectory in July. Let me put it that way. Nobody's creative media department is struggling for content in July. Let me put it that way. And so we look at our FanDuel odds, and man, they're playing 7 of the top 20 teams in the country this year. Preseason odds to win it all. So you could be a pretty good team. You could be pretty motivated. Still get beat on Saturdays, which means the questions will ultimately be on the field. It's not how motivated you are. It's not how together you are. Those things matter. But you're going to win close games? Are your games going to be close? Are you going to be able to depend on that offensive line? Are you going to have a quarterback that you really can lean on like you think you can? These sorts of things weighing on my mind heavily as we try and gauge South Carolina. And then at LSU, I talked to a ton of LSU media yesterday, and I noticed this trend, which was kind of weird because I don't feel this way. They almost had accepted the default that since the defense was so bad last year, and since they didn't make a ton of personnel moves, they made a ton of coaching moves, but not a ton of personnel moves, then maybe the bar should be lowered just a little bit. No, it shouldn't. That's LSU. No, it shouldn't. You ought to be disgusted at what last year brought you, which was a Heisman Trophy quarterback and a 9-3 year in the regular season because your defense sucked. But that shouldn't be what's accepted at LSU. That should be a one-year aberration, and you look back on that once this year gets corrected and say, oh, hopefully never again. Now, I've got my doubts. about how improved the defense can be. I think it will be better. How much it's improved, I don't know. But this is not some window program. This is not LSU where you got to say, all right, well, if we're really good at recruiting, you know, if we're really careful, maybe a couple of years from now we can contend. It's every year there. You ought to be contending and competing for it all every year there. And that's not the energy Brian Kelly gave all. Kelly's all about it. He's all in. But some of the media around LSU, unless I'm missing my mark, and I talked to several of them, were almost like, well, 9.5 over-under win total. But I mean, you know, 8-4, 9-3, like that's pretty good. Really? I got plenty of LSU folks watching the show. Really? Your program, not mine. Is that how you feel? The entire show is brought to you by Academy Sports and Outdoors because they made it possible for us to come on the road. They have for a long time. But Late Kick Live brought to you by Academy Sports and Outdoors just rolls off the tongue. I am still full from lunch. And I think it's partially because they brought mahi-mahi in here today. And the other part is because I had lunch with our friends from Academy Sports and Outdoors. And it's a shame that we couldn't pull up 2 more chairs here and they could have made their on-cam debut. Things have been great for a long time between our respective brands. And so I got a story for you. This has to do with you guys. I can't tell you who it is. But suffice it to say, there's another pretty big show out there in sports media that came to our friends at Academy and said, the way that the audience acts on Pate's show, how do we get that? How do we recreate that? Like it's bottled up and they just kind of break the bottle open and that happens. If I could just send a gift card to every one of you, by the way, right now, I would, because that is worth its weight in Beyond Gold for us. We appreciate that a lot. Academy appreciates it. Believe me, as we sat there over dessert, they wanted me to reiterate how much they appreciate that. Hey, just go check them out in store. You need what they have anyway. I mean, all of us are at least somewhat active outdoors, and so if you are blessed to be able to get outdoors, you got some free time, do whatever you want to do. I don't care if it's volleyball or it's picnicking, camping, hiking, grilling, whatever. Just make sure you go to Academy because they've got everything you need. And I know what you're thinking. Well, Josh, I live in the remotest part of Wyoming. They don't have an Academy here. It's pretty up there, isn't it? You got internet, though, academy.com. And so they can get you shipped whatever you need. But make sure you check them out because the show, especially when we're on the road, brought to you by Academy Sports and Outdoors. They're watching us in Ontario, Canada. Thank you so much. Statesboro, Georgia, and Bend, Oregon. Appreciated viewership from all across the country and beyond. All right, let's talk about some what-ifs, and I've got several more angles to get to tonight. Got some stuff on Sark, just some wild opinions on Sark. Who knows? Maybe more of you think this than I thought. In the meantime, though, some of the biggest what-ifs in college football this year, let me bounce you a wild scenario from the Big Ten. Oregon and Ohio State. Everyone expects them to do big things this year, right? I do too. What if neither one of them makes the Big Ten championship game? How would this happen? Is this even possible? Well, it's improbable, but it is possible. I had Stats and Info run the numbers, and mathematically, it's possible. This is number 1 and number 2 in odds to win the Big Ten. They have top 3 or top 4 odds, each one of them, to win the whole thing this year. So yeah, keeping them out of a 12-team playoff would be a stretch. Crazy things happen all the time in this sport. So let's just say, what happens? The Will Howard experiment doesn't pan out at Ohio State. The offensive line costs them a couple of games. Oregon, who knows, maybe they're not as ready physically as we thought they'd be to join the Big Ten. Whatever happened. Maybe it's just big injuries on both teams. Whatever happens. If they're out, who was responsible for it? If it was injury, okay, that's one thing. But if they're relatively healthy and they both get bounced out of this thing, they're not even playing in Indianapolis, that means there were at least 2 teams in the conference better than them because we're not in a division era anymore. We just flat out take the best 2 teams. Was there a dark horse that emerged? Certainly Michigan had to be part of this because Michigan plays both of these teams. So I've got to assume Sharon Moore and Michigan just soared this year. If Ohio State and Oregon are out of the thing, they're not in the Big Ten title game. But who else? Or whomst else? Did Lincoln Riley and USC really make that big of a statement? Did Nebraska come from the rafters? Luke Fickell, Wisconsin, year 2? What happened? Penn State? Penn State, it very well could be Penn State. What has to have happened Not for them to miss the playoff. We're talking about them missing the conference championship game. And then, well, we were talking about that as a staff earlier today. Somebody who shall remain nameless, but rhymes with Jaducer Pesci, said, well, this would be good for the Big Ten, right? Because that means that quality depth must have emerged. I would counter with this: no. That's my counter. No. To a point, I get it. Like, to a point, yeah, it'd be great, like we talked about the other night, if Nebraska, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Penn State, whoever you want to throw in there, they formed this solid tier 2 at the expense of Ohio State and Oregon not even playing in Indianapolis. I'm not sure if we might not have pushed it a little bit too far there for the Big Ten. Reasonable minds can disagree on that one. Next up, probably harder to believe for some folks than the first one. What if Florida is a top 15 team this year? Stop laughing. Be respectful. Let's just talk this through, you and I. What if they're a top 15 team? Not top 5, not even top 10, just 13, 14, 15, somewhere around there. Well, first off, I'm a believer that if Florida really is the 15th best team in the country this year, they'll never finish ranked 15th. Because if Florida is the 15th best team in the country, and you look at their schedule, they probably still play 5 teams minimum better than 15th in the country. And if we just draw it out on paper like it normally would play out, they could be like a 6-6 or 7-5 team and reasonably be the 15th best team in the country. Well, they wouldn't be ranked 15th at that point. So then you get to the whole, how do you judge them? How would anyone know? Forget 15, even if they're 20th. If Florida's the 20th best team in the country, that means they're better than what you thought they were preseason. Because hardly anyone thinks they're one of the 20 best teams. So if they're the 20th best team at the end of the year, technically they overachieved from a raw performative standpoint. Would you be able to measure it accurately? In other words, would you be able to watch Florida and know they're any good? Part A. Part B, how would Billy Napier be judged? Would people be fair on it? Would they realize, wow, he just improved this team. Record doesn't look like it, but he just improved this team. I have no idea. I'd have to see it play out. And number 3, we're going to go way off the grid for this one. Will Rogers, where is he? Anyone remember? He's not in Starkville anymore. He's in Washington. He's in Seattle. What if Will Rogers is a top 5 quarterback this year? Did Jed Fish pull this off? How would this go down? There are new staff at Washington, new quarterback. 20 of 22 starters are replaced. Everyone thinks it's just a total reset job up there. Me included, I think that. Not a total reset in terms of, like, you got to start from 1 or 2 wins and work your way up, but it's newness. It's just a lot of newness. Washington's program was actually left in a very good way. So, a lot of the skeleton, the nuts and bolts of the program, they're in a really good way. It's just a lot of unknown. Well, if all of a sudden part of the unknown is known, and that known is, well, Will Rogers is top 5 quarterback this year, that would mean that Washington ended up being obviously way better than they're expected. And guess who they play this year? They play Michigan, they play USC, they play at Oregon, they play, I believe, at Penn State. So it would mean, in the aggregate, a lot of those teams ended up getting tests that they didn't think they'd get. Over-under win total 6.5 for Washington. Coming off a national championship appearance. Coming off a playoff win over Texas. Coming off beating Oregon twice last year. Why do I not remember those games? Oh, it's because I picked against them both times and I tried to erase it from my memory. So yeah, that's what What If's all about, man. Throw the craziest stuff imaginable out there. Maybe some of it will stick. We've been doing our whole court of public opinion thing. I like to do that this time of year. As I explained the other day, I just like gathering as much public opinion on as many people in this sport, head coaches, as possible. So, Colin, here's a good endpoint for you. What do you think of Steve Sarkisian? Don't look at the live chat. Don't look at the comments. Don't ask your buddy or anything like that. Just you and you alone. I'm going to make my opinion. You make your opinion. What do you think of Steve Sarkisian? There's a lot of variance, a surprising amount of variance. When I posted this earlier today on Twitter, at LateKickJosh, I asked, what do you think? And I got a ton of replies, and it went everywhere from a group of people thinking he's a slam dunk top 5 coach in the sport right now to a bunch of people saying, yeah, last year was good, but it may have been just a blip on the radar. We need to see a lot more from him. Both may be fair. I will tell you, I got a few people who said things like, he's Jimbo Fisher without a ring. Well, that's a little bit harsh. I've seen Sark's desk. It's not nearly as messy as Jimbo. I think he's doing okay there. How will he handle matching up with elite teams more often, one of you said. That I'm going to get back to in a second. That's a good point. And then another said, he's the French toast and Texas is the syrup, which basically just means once you take one and you dip it into the other, that thing is made all that much better. It always had potential. French toast always has potential. You just need the powdered sugar. Some of you put fruit on it. I'm not that guy. And then you've got the syrup, which is a must. It kind of feels that way, doesn't it? You think about the situation he was in. Part of it is off the field related, is personal life related. Part of it is not getting it done enough on the field to the liking of his bosses in years past. And you know that story. I'm going to come back to that. But think about what it could have been versus what it is for Sark. Now, let me go back to what one of you said. How will he handle matching up with elite teams more often? I'm going to soften it a little bit. Just comparable teams. Don't even say elite. Comparable teams. In other words, teams that have a comparable roster to his. They used to not face any in the regular season because it was the Big 12. They outmanned every team they played except for Oklahoma. In most years, they may have a slight talent roster advantage over Oklahoma, although it didn't matter a lot because Oklahoma still beat them more times than not. Maybe that's changed, maybe it doesn't, but think about it, it's not just Oklahoma now. They play Georgia this year. Any given year, they could have Bama, LSU, Georgia, and Tennessee on the schedule, and Oklahoma. That's 5 games. I mean, that's a realistic schedule where they could play almost half of their games against teams that have comparable rosters to them. In other words, it's the kind of game where you can't afford to play C+ and win. And there have been some times where Texas can afford to play C+ ball and win. I think that's a fair question. A totally fair question. It's not doubting. It's just a fair question. But realize how fortunate Steve Sarkisian is. Steve Sarkisian got his shot to be a head coach, and it didn't ultimately pan out for him. And then he ends up at Bama, briefly goes to Atlanta, and then back to Bama, and he's the offensive coordinator on that 2020 national title team. Some of the best work I've ever seen done. But with how checkered his past was, and with how unproven he was as a head coach, think about how this would have played out 99 times out of 100. If you had the past he had had, and then he goes to Bama, even though he kills it as the offensive coordinator there, normally that person would have had to go probably the G5 route, high-level FCS route, or a much lower tier Power 4 job as a head coach before they get Texas. Hardly anyone would have had that past and then go straight from Bama assistant coach to Texas head coach. Sark did. Now, as he took that Texas job, remember what changed in the sport. The NIL and portal combination upended the sport. And then all of a sudden, you have what you have now, which is if you're a G5 coach, the better you do, the more you get punished. Because the better you do at evaluating the guys you have, and the better you do at developing them, the better they play. Sounds good, right? No, then you get to the end of the year, and the big boys just come poach your roster. They buy your players out from under you, and you're punished. There's nothing you can do. You can't afford to keep them. So you get punished. And then the next year, your roster gets stripped, and your coaching staff gets stripped, and you go 4-8, and you did everything right. And the public sits there and screams at you in December, you are what your record says you are, and you get fired. What if Sark had to go that route? Is there any guarantee? No matter how good he is there any guarantee? Because y'all are crapping on a lot of good G5 coaches right now because they're getting their rosters rated. Sark didn't have to go that route. That's just something to think about as he does whatever he ends up doing. Think about it. Going from Bama assistant straight to Texas head coach. I have opinions on Sark. I think he's second to none as an offensive mind, as an offensive play caller. I love that he's an imperfect person who has certainly capitalized on second chances. He'd be the first one to tell you that. I think he values the right things in terms of building a program. the structure, the organization, the attention to detail. He heavily leans into that stuff to the point where you wonder, man, can he stay as sharp as he needs to offensively because of how invested he is as a head coach in the other, mechanisms of his program. But Steve Sarkisian still got a lot of chapters left to write in his book. It's going to be fun to watch, really fun to watch. Because if they come in the SEC and they do fulfill on the hype and they go to Atlanta in year one, you're in the playoff at that point, I would imagine, and you're doing some really special things at that point. All right, moving on. Good pace here. Appreciate you guys being tuned in. I know it's a little earlier than normal, and if you're watching tomorrow or listening tomorrow on podcast, don't worry. None of this means anything to you. But we just went a little early tonight because we could, because the day's over here. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel and subscribe to the pod. Number one college football pod in the world for about 2 weeks now. It's been there. And we've been number one in the YouTube space forever. So thank you guys so much. That's cause of you. That's not cause of us. Is Miami a playoff contender this year? There's 12 of them, mind you. Remember that. There's 12 of them. So you may hate Miami. That's okay. Are they a playoff contender? Odds makers say they are. FanDuel says they are. They got them right there in the thick of the playoff mix. Also, Miami, as of this week, the third best odds to win the ACC. But those are odds. You could be very quick in the live chat to say, well, odds don't mean anything. Odds makers get it wrong every year. I don't know if they get it wrong. Just because things don't shake out exactly according to the odds market doesn't mean they got it wrong. But my advice is if you think it's wrong, go bet it. So their over-under win total is 9.5 right now. That is heavily juiced to the under, but it's 9.5 right now. They're plus 440 to win the ACC. They're plus 210 to make the playoff. They're right there in the mix. What has to happen there? They have to execute in games. That's what has to happen. Yes, it's great to talk about transfer portal, and they've done a great job in that front. Yes, it's great to talk about recruiting. They've done better and better and better as the years have gone on that front. It's great to talk about energy in the program, and that place runs on Colombian coffee. They're good. They're Cuban coffee. Oh, no. If we weren't live, I would have us restart because I know that's going to get clipped from certain people in the program down there. I apologize. Cuban coffee. Energy, incredible. You've got to do it on Saturday. We all know that. And there were times where they did and they didn't last year. So that over-under win total of 9.5 means you got to win double-digit games this year to hit that over. And if they do that, they're in the playoff. I've got to imagine. Cam Ward coming down there could end up being one of the difference-making moments in Mario Cristobal's career. Think about this. No matter what you think about NIL, he's there. And it's largely because of that. They were relentless in their pursuit of him. They've got him. And then once they got him, that program led by Mario Cristobal said, yeah, we're going to break the bank. We're going over the cliff, load this roster up as much as we can. We may never get an opportunity like this again. What if they capitalize on it? I know what the conversation will be. Like, people will doubt Miami right up until the seconds count down off the clock and they win something of note because they haven't done that yet. So they'll have their doubters. That's fine. There's a lot of tangible reason to doubt. Miami's been a program that's wandered for a while. The difference is not that I try and defend that. I don't defend the ineptitude they've had down there for a long time. What I say is, to the crowd that thinks it's that way because Miami can't do that anymore, the only thing I've said to them is, well, tell me why. And then that you bring these generalities at me like, well, the game's passed them by. The game's not passed them by. Elite kids still play football in South Florida. They just have gone other places to play their college ball. So you keep enough of them home and you execute with them on Saturdays and develop them the right way. Voila, you win football games. It's that simple. They're a playoff contender this year. Firmly believe that. Been down there to watch them twice work out. I'll probably go down there again before the season starts. I know what playoff caliber football teams and playoff caliber rosters look like. They look like one. It's getting it done on Saturday. It's coaches making the right decisions. It's players being put in the right position, players executing when they're in the right position. That quarterback position has to be one of the best in the country. It should be. Cam Ward should be one of the best in the country. If they do that, they're a playoff contender. And at that point, well, it's off to the races. But before that point, they should accept nothing less. I promise you no one in that organization is leaning away from that. Like, no one's shying away from that. I'd lean into it if I were a fan base. I mean, that's the fun of summer. That's the fun of it all. Don't be cautious. Who wants to be cautious? It's not a speed zone we're driving through here. Just go 100 miles an hour into the season. Another of the biggest questions to me in the sport this year, and I actually am going to ask you to pause because I have to type in something. Oh, wow, internet's good here, Gigi. It came up really quick. So think about the best seasons we've had. Schedule. Think about some of the, what are your favorite seasons that we've had? Like, everyone goes to 07 if you were around, and with good reason. 07 was as chaotic as like anything we've ever seen. So here's the question. Colin, here's a good endpoint for you. How much chaos will we have in the first few weeks of the season this year? There's always a thought that you have the top 5 established when you go into a college football season. So this year, you know, like, for example, people will come in saying Georgia's the overwhelming favorite to do this or that. Hey, that's all well and good, and they've earned that. What if they were to lose to Clemson in week 1? You're talking about a bomb going off in college football. It shouldn't be viewed that way because Clemson's a really good team, but they're going to be a double-digit underdog. They're nearly a 2-touchdown underdog to Georgia. And teams like Georgia, when you give them extended time to prepare for games and they're all healthy because you play them at the beginning of the season, dude, that's a hard team to beat. If Clemson were to do that, are we talking about any team at that point as the overwhelming favorite to win it all? And then think about what we could have in week 2. Texas goes to Michigan. What if Michigan pulls that off? Think about how differently you're talking about the Big Ten. That's not even a conference game. But all of a sudden you're saying, yeah, Oregon, yeah, Ohio State. Dude, Michigan, like Sharon Moore, week 2, they already took this guy down. They already took Sark down. That defense clamped down on Quinn Ewers. Well, if they did that, they could compete against anybody. And the SEC would probably look way, way more open at that point. And by the way, speaking of the SEC, it's not all roses for them because that Sunday night game in week 1 is in Vegas. What if USC were to beat LSU? Tons of questions around LSU, already are. They would just be amplified at that point. But speaking of changing the landscape of the Big Ten, how would it be appropriate to look at USC at that point? What if people like me are wrong? What if their defense really is way more improved than I think is reasonable to expect them to be improved? So you start talking about that stuff. You know, you start talking about the big upsets that could happen. Bama at Wisconsin early in the year. What if? It's not a massive point spread game. What if? So you can look at that from a game-by-game perspective, or you could just say, all right, let's go broad strokes here. Take the top teams. I don't care how you want to do them, 1 through 5, 1 through 10. What if Texas's defensive line just not good enough to hold up? Losing those guys, it was hard to replace them. They're vulnerable there. The wide receivers they got from the portal don't end up being everything they thought they'd be. Georgia defensive line, just not there. Injury could always crop up as well. Bama, year 1 under Kalen DeBoer, maybe Jalen Milroe doesn't grab the offense and run with it like you hoped he would. Maybe the depth Nick Saban himself talked about with Alabama maybe being a vulnerability. Maybe they're not deep enough this year. Maybe Ohio State's offensive line and quarterback is a step or 2 below the elite level. My point is, if any or all of these things happen, you've got yourself a wide open field. You didn't need playoff expansion to make it happen. You just needed the game to work the way it normally does. But since we're in the expanded playoff era, if you have that, forget about fighting for the 11 and 12 seed. Even the top 5 or 6 seeds could be very imperfect teams. And at that point, and I think we'll probably know it midway through the season, at that point, you could have a wide open playoff race where it really is get in and you could win. And if that's the case, that's the one area. In a year where you don't have elite teams, that's the year where the expanded college football playoff could actually make 25 teams have hope of a title in November. It could be fool's gold. And of course, we could have a couple of elite teams emerge like we do most years. And you could be saying it doesn't matter who makes it in. They're just going to be served up for slaughter come December or January. That's why we got to know how much chaos we're going to have. And if you're going to have chaos, that is an underdog bettor's dream. And to do that, you need to look no further than FanDuel. exclusive odds provider of our show. We appreciate them for basically giving us any feedback we need. We're looking really forward to partnering with them this fall. Friday night lines, from hotel rooms coast to coast. We like to do that when we're on the road. They help us out and will help us out with that. You can go over there right now. If you want to bet these things, if you don't buy into Miami, bet them to miss the playoff. If you do believe Texas can win the SEC, okay, well, believe and then go bet it. If you don't bet at all, that's totally cool. You can just go over there and look. FanDuel, though, is the place to go. It's our partner, exclusive odds provider, and we appreciate them so much. And again, expanding our relationship with them for the fall. Let's wrap up with some good old-fashioned bold predictions. And again, before we get out of here, I want to thank you guys. No, we're not ending the show yet, but I want to thank you guys because it used to be that when we went on the road, and especially we did shows at irregular times, we'd hope to get 100 people, watching, and that's not a concern for us anymore. So thank you so much for that. Bold prediction time. We've done several chapters of this. What do you believe that you think is really bold, but you would bet your own money on it? First up, Texas A&M beating Notre Dame by double digits in week 1. We got a line on the game. FanDuel, courtesy of FanDuel, A&M -1.5. That's your line on that game right now. Game's in College Station. They didn't put it in the Texans Stadium. They didn't put it in Jerry World. They put a college football game. Believe the audacity to do this. They put a college football game in a college football stadium in week 1. I wonder if it'll work. Whew. We'll see. Forecast high, about 116 that day. Both teams have new offensive coordinators. So Colin Klein is the new OC at A&M. So you're saying he's going to go in there and he's going to beat Notre Dame by double digits. That's interesting. Both of these teams have top 20 defenses. I'd be more inclined to look at the under at 48.5, honestly. But Texas A&M under Mike Elko now, year 1, total wild card. I will admit that. I'll grant you that. It'd be a huge shot heard around college football, and it would be fitting if we went all of these months, everyone's talking about Texas, and our dark horse, and I'm patting myself on the chest preemptively because we have been talking about him a lot. What if Mike Elko serves up a 23-10 win over Notre Dame? That's an 8.25 on the boldness scale, by the way, but it could happen. Next up, this is a little bolder. No new SEC or Big Ten teams will make the playoff. That's a 9.25 for me. Bordered on the 9.5. Oregon, big favorite to make it, -290. Texas is -230. So they're both heavily favored to make the playoff. And even if that happens, even if they don't make it, you still got to make sure USC doesn't come out of nowhere. You still got to make sure Oklahoma doesn't find their offensive line's footing and they make a run. So, my point is, if Texas doesn't make it, there's a likelihood it's because they lost to Oklahoma. And if Oklahoma beats Texas, that's part of a really, really good playoff-looking resume. Ditto with USC. Maybe Oregon didn't make it because USC ended up making it instead. So, because of that, I think this is bold enough to be a 9.25. One of those new teams is going to be in the playoff. At least one of them. Clemson has a single-digit win season. That's a 7 on the boldness scale. You know why? Because they're over Clemson's win total is 9.5. Do you understand that? So odds makers themselves, with that number juiced to the under, by the way, are telling you it's more likely than not to us that they finish with single-digit wins. This right here happened last year. So they won single-digit games last year. That was the first time that happened since 2010. But if you go back to the 2018 national title game, and they won that, they had 0 losses that year. Here's how many losses they've had every year since then. They had 0 that year. 1 loss the following year. 2 losses after that. 3 losses. 3 losses. 4 losses. This is called a trend, I'm told. And so there's reason to believe, especially when you got Georgia right out the gate. Then you play NC State, good team. Florida State on the road. They've got Louisville. They've got South Carolina. This wouldn't be crazy. A 9-3 season is not a bad season. And so if that's all that's got to happen for this to hit, that's a 7 on the boldness scale. And lastly, How about an individual here? Darius Taylor of Minnesota leads the Big Ten in rushing. That's only an 8.75. It sounds a lot bolder than it is. So you may think, oh man, Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, surely Ohio State will, well, stop. Because we said an individual. So, if Darius Taylor totes the rock by himself 25 times a game, nobody at Ohio State is going to do that. So he may very well lead individually in rushing. They returned 4 starters on the O-line there. He had 3 games last year out of 6 that he played in with 190 plus on the ground. He had 800 rushing yards through 6 games as a true freshman. They did portal in multiple running backs. And you do have a guy like Donovan Edwards at Michigan. Rutgers has got a guy too that could individually carry a lion's share of the carries in the backfield. But this is not crazy bold. I think it's an 8.75, not crazy bold. Thank you guys so much. We're going to do a live show Thursday too. So, every 48 hours here this time of year, thereabouts, we do a show. Make sure that you are following on the socials at Late Kick Josh, because there's a lot going on here. I can't promise all of it makes it on the show. And make sure you and at least 5 of your friends are subscribed to the channel, subscribe to the podcast feed. It makes our job so much easier, and it makes it so much fun to go and sit before management and say, who are you to doubt us if they believe in us? And one day I will use that line. Thank you so much for our crew here on the road, our crew back in Nashville. I'm Josh Pate. Take care. We'll see you Thursday. Until then, God bless.